Hey everyone, and welcome back. Today we're diving deep, really deep, into immigration.
Ooh, sounds intense.
It is, but not in the way you might think. We're not getting into today's headlines or political debates.
Right, right.
We're going way back in time to uncover how historical patterns shape the way we view immigration today.
Yeah, even if we don't realize it, it's like our opinions are built on this foundation we might not even see.
Exactly. And our guide for this journey is a recent blog post. It's called The Echoes of History.
Catchy title?
Right. I don't know about you, but I've definitely heard some opinions on immigration and thought, where did that come from?
Oh, yeah, all the time.
So that's our mission today, uncovering those historical roots and maybe even understanding our own reactions a bit better along the way.
I love that. It's like we're all products of our past, right? And immigration is so woven into that.
You know, that's something that really struck me reading this source. It reminded me that humans have always migrated. It's not some new phenomenon.
It's like literally in our DNA, we're a species on the move.
Okay, so I get that people have always moved around for various reasons. But WHY, I mean, fleeing famine or war, that makes sense to me.
Yeah.
But did our ancestors also get wanderlust?
You know, it's fascinating to think about. Early humans were constantly on the move, following food sources, adapting to changing climates. We're talking tens of thousands of years ago.
Wow.
Migrations across continents, shaping the very genetic makeup of humanity. Then you have, like, the Bantu migrations across Africa.
I vaguely remember that from history class, but refresh my memory.
So the Bantu migrations were driven by agricultural advancements, and they ended up spreading language and culture across this huge region. So many factors play a role. It's not just one thing.
Okay, yeah, that's way more complex than I was picturing.
Right. And it puts things in perspective when we think about immigration today. It's like this urge to move, to seek new opportunities, it's kind of ingrained in us.
That makes a lot of sense. But as societies became more, established, how did these motivations change?
That's where we start to see shifts in the WHY of migration. For example, think about the Industrial Revolution.
It's a huge change, yeah.
Suddenly, cities became these centers of opportunity, drawing people from rural areas and from other countries with promises of jobs, a new life. Does that sound familiar?
Totally. Like same story, different century, people flocking to where the work is.
Exactly. But then they also face the challenges of adapting to a new environment, competing for resources.
And I'm guessing not always being welcomed with open arms.
Unfortunately, that's a pattern we see throughout history. As more people arrive, especially from diverse backgrounds, existing populations react with fear sometimes, prejudice.
And speaking of prejudice, our source talks about the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882 in the U.S.
Oh, yeah, that's a tough one.
I have to admit, reading about that was a real punch in the gut. Like, wow, this really happened.
It's a blatant example of how fear and economic anxiety can be manipulated to justify discrimination.
Yeah.
This act targeted Chinese laborers specifically.
Yeah, barring them from entering the country, even denying citizenship to those already here.
It wasn't subtle at all. Blatant racism driven by the perception that Chinese immigrants were taking jobs, threatening American culture.
It just blows my mind that something like that could happen in a country supposedly founded on freedom and equality.
It's a reminder that ideals and reality don't always line up. And the Chinese Exclusion Act wasn't an isolated incident.
Right. I mean, sadly, there are a lot of examples of this kind of thing.
It reflects a larger pattern of nativism, these exclusionary policies directed at different groups throughout U.S. history.
And what's really unsettling is how the legacy of those acts continues to resonate in today's debates about immigration.
Like, even when we see seemingly positive changes.
You're talking about the Immigration and Nationality Act of 1965.
Yes. It aimed to get rid of those discriminatory quotas based on national origin.
It seems like a step in the right direction, for sure.
It was. But it's crucial to understand what it replaced. Before 1965, the U.S. had this quota system that heavily favored immigrants from Northern and Western Europe, basically shutting the door on people from other parts of the world. And that system was rooted in these racist ideologies. Certain nationalities were seen as more desirable.
So even though the 1965 Act was progress, it was still working within a system shaped by decades of discriminatory policies.
It's like trying to build a house on a foundation that's already cracked.
Oh, I like that analogy.
Right. You might make improvements to the house itself, but those underlying flaws can still impact the structure.
Okay, so we've got this long, complicated history of people moving around, different motivations, patterns of both welcome and rejection. How does this actually shape our thinking about immigration today? Like, get into the nitty-gritty here.
That's where the source dives into the really fascinating stuff. It's about
Yeah.
the power of cultural narratives.
Narratives. Okay, elaborate on that.
These narratives are often based on stereotypes, on historical prejudices, and they influence how we see immigrants.
Even without us realizing it.
Exactly. It's like
Yeah.
we absorb these stories, these images, and they become part of our mental framework.
You mean like the stories we've all heard, maybe growing up, about certain immigrant groups being lazy or criminals or a drain on society?
Exactly. Even if we consciously reject those ideas, they can linger in our subconscious and affect our views.
It's insidious, really.
It is. And the source gives this example from the early 20th century in the U.S. when Southern and Eastern European immigrants were demonized.
Interesting.
They were often portrayed as unskilled laborers, threats to American culture and jobs, even associated with radical political ideologies.
Hold on. Doesn't that sound kind of familiar? Haven't we heard similar things said about other groups more recently?
It's the same playbook, just different actors. It shows how these historical narratives, often rooted in fear and prejudice, can be recycled and applied to new groups of immigrants.
Ugh. It's like we're trapped in this echo chamber of history, repeating the same mistakes.
It can feel that way sometimes, for sure.
But I'm also curious, how much of this is driven by economics? I mean, let's be honest, money talks.
Oh, absolutely. The economic impact of immigration is huge, and it's a major part of the debate.
The source actually presents both sides of the argument, which I appreciated.
It's essential for a nuanced understanding, right? On the one hand, there's this long history of immigrants boosting economies.
They fill labor gaps, start businesses.
Bring new skills, ideas, contribute to innovation. There's a lot of research showing that areas with more ethnic diversity often have stronger economic growth.
Makes sense. More perspectives, more talent, more creativity.
It's like having a more vibrant ecosystem, right?
Right.
The more diverse it is, the more resilient and adaptable.
Okay, that's the positive side. But what about those concerns we hear about job competition, wage suppression, strain on social services?
Those are valid concerns, and the source acknowledges them. It's important to have an honest conversation about that stuff.
Because it's easy to just focus on one side of the story.
Right. But what's often missing from the debate is the long-term perspective. Meaning, while there might be some short-term challenges when a lot of immigrants integrate into a society, research shows that the long-term economic benefits often outweigh those challenges.
So it's about taking a more nuanced view, recognizing that the impact is complex.
Exactly. It can't be reduced to simple sound bites.
Okay, so we've gone from ancient human migrations to economic impacts. Immigration is complex, clearly. But how does it all fit together when it comes to our WN identities, like on a personal level?
That's a great question, and it leads us into the next part of our discussion. The source points out that national identity is deeply tied to how a country views immigration.
So countries with a strong multicultural past, where immigration has been constant, those tend to be more welcoming to newcomers today.
It's not a hard and fast rule, but there's definitely a correlation. Those countries often have a different way of seeing immigration. It's woven into their story, seen as a source of strength, dynamism.
Okay, so what about places that haven't had that same experience, places that have been more homogenous? Does that mean they're doomed to conflict when it comes to immigration?
It's not about destiny or predetermined outcomes, but understanding the historical context is key.
I see, so different starting points.
Right. Countries that haven't had as much exposure to diverse cultures may need to work harder to build bridges of understanding, create a more inclusive environment. It's a process, and history shows us it's possible.
That's a bit more hopeful than I was expecting. But let's get to some real-world examples. How does all this history actually play out?
You got it. Let's start with a powerful one. Vietnamese refugees after the Vietnam War. Major turning point for the U.S.
Yeah, I know a little bit about this, but refresh my memory.
So the U.S. was facing this humanitarian crisis and took in hundreds of thousands of Vietnamese refugees.
Fleeing the aftermath of the war.
Right. It was huge. And while there was compassion and a desire to help, there were also fears about the impact on jobs, resources, even cultural identity. Sound familiar?
It's like a microcosm of the whole immigration debate, playing out in a short period of time.
Exactly. And it reminds us that even with good intentions, integrating that many people into a new society is never easy. There will be challenges, anxieties, and a need for empathy on all sides.
Okay, powerful example. What about something more recent, something still unfolding?
Well, the source also highlights the Syrian refugee crisis.
Oh, man. That was just heartbreaking. So many people displaced.
It's a reminder of the human cost of conflict And it's a test case for how we respond to these crises as a global community. The source focuses on the struggles the EU has faced in coordinating a response.
They haven't exactly been unified on this issue, have they?
Right. And it shows how anxieties about immigration run deep, even in a region that's supposedly progressive and interconnected.
So even in the 21st century, with all our advancements, we're still grappling with those fundamental questions about who belongs, who deserves help, how we balance our own interests with our humanitarian obligations.
It's sobering, isn't it? But I think that's a power of understanding history. We see these issues not as isolated events, but as part of this larger tapestry, woven with both progress and setbacks, compassion and fear.
Wow, okay, we've covered a lot in this first part of our deep dive. Ancient human migrations to modern crises. Feeling a bit overwhelmed, not going to lie. But I'm also eager to hear more. Specifically, what can we learn from all this? What are the takeaways that can actually help us navigate these issues in a more informed, compassionate way?
That is the perfect question to lead us into the next part of our discussion, because it's not enough to just dwell on the past, right? The real value is extracting those lessons, the good and the bad, and applying them to our present and future.
Okay, I am hooked. Let's take a quick break, and then we'll come back to tackle those questions head on.
Can't wait. Welcome back to our deep dive into the echoes of immigration. Before the break, we were talking about how understanding the past can help us navigate the really complex realities of immigration today.
And I'm really curious to explore that more because we've seen the good, the bad, the ugly, but how do we actually use this knowledge to move forward? Our source, thankfully, doesn't leave us just feeling totally overwhelmed.
Right. It ends on this surprisingly hopeful note, talking about a future where immigration is seen as part of our shared societal fabric. And that's a powerful idea. But I have to admit, after all we've discussed, part of me wonders, is that really possible?
I feel that too. I mean, we've seen how deeply ingrained some of these negative attitudes can be, even in countries that have historically been more multicultural. There's still tension, bait. So how do we actually bridge those divides? Where do we even begin?
Well, the source gives us some clues. One thing it emphasizes is this importance of proactive engagement. Like, we can't just sit back and hope for the best. We need to actively work to change the narrative.
To educate ourselves.
Yes, educate ourselves and others and challenge those harmful stereotypes that have taken root over centuries.
It's making me think back to what we discussed about those cultural narratives. The stories we tell ourselves, the images we see, they all contribute to how we perceive immigration. So maybe part of the solution is changing those narratives.
Exactly. We need more stories that highlight the positive contributions of immigrants, the resilience they've shown, the richness they bring to our societies. We need to move beyond those simplistic and often fear-mongering depictions that dominate the headlines and dig deeper.
I think that starts with being mindful of the language we use, the assumptions we make, even the information we consume. Am I perpetuating stereotypes even unintentionally? Am I seeking out diverse perspectives? Those are questions I think we should all be asking.
It's about taking ownership of our own biases and being willing to challenge them. And it also means having those uncomfortable conversations, maybe with friends or family members who hold on to outdated or prejudiced views.
Yeah, that's not always easy, but remembering what the source said about how throughout history, progress has often been driven by individuals who are willing to stand up and speak out against injustice. It's about finding our own voice and using it to advocate for a more inclusive world.
And it's not just about individual actions, though, right? We can't ignore the need for systemic change. The source talks about how even well-intentioned policies can be flawed if they're built on a foundation of past inequalities.
Like what we were saying with the Chinese Exclusion Act and its legacy, that didn't just vanish overnight. It took decades to dismantle those discriminatory laws, and the impacts are still felt today.
Which means we can't just be tweaking the system around the edges, right? We need to reevaluate its foundations. What assumptions are baked into our laws? Are there unintentional biases at play? Are we truly centering the needs and experiences of immigrant communities in policymaking?
Whoa, those are big questions. And this is where things can get politically charged, isn't it? There are so many different viewpoints on what constitutes fair immigration policies, and those debates can be incredibly divisive.
No doubt about it, but what I think the source is getting at is that we need to move beyond the rhetoric and focus on the human element. What does it actually mean for someone to be uprooted from their home, to navigate a new culture, to build a life in a place where they might not always feel welcome?
It's about empathy, right? Putting ourselves in the shoes of others, trying to understand their experiences. Facts and figures are important, but they don't tell the whole story.
Exactly. And that's where things like art, literature, personal testimonies, those can be so powerful. They help us connect with the human side of immigration, to see beyond those stereotypes and statistics.
Okay, so we've got a lot to work with here. Honest storytelling, ongoing education, policy reform, fostering empathy. It's a multi-pronged approach, but it feels hopeful,
Yeah.
you know.
I agree. What strikes me is that the source isn't presenting a single solution, but rather a shift in mindset. Seeing immigration not as a problem to be contained, but as an opportunity for growth, for innovation, for cultural enrichment.
And that's a powerful message to end on, because ultimately it's about recognizing our shared humanity, our interconnectedness across borders, across cultures. That's what I'm taking away from this deep dive.
And I think it's the perfect note to leave our listeners with as well. This was a journey through history, yes, but it's also a call to action.
Yeah.
What will you do to contribute to a future where immigration is seen as part of our shared societal fabric? That's the question we want you to ponder.
Because this isn't just a conversation for policymakers or academics, it's a conversation for all of us. So let's keep learning, keep challenging our assumptions, and keep working towards a world that welcomes and celebrates the contributions of immigrants.
Beautifully said. And with that, we've reached the end of our deep dive. We've covered a lot of ground, but hopefully we've also sparked some new insights and inspired you to keep exploring this topic. It's fascinating and ever-evolving.
We've only scratched the surface here, and there's so much more to uncover. We encourage you to check out the full blog post, The Echoes of History. We've got it linked in the show notes. It's a thought-provoking read, and I think it will challenge your assumptions and deepen your understanding of this critical issue.
And remember, this isn't just an academic exercise. The way we think about and talk about immigration has real-world consequences. It shapes our policies, our communities, and our interactions with one another. So let's use this knowledge to build a more informed, empathetic, and just world for everyone.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive, and we'll see you next time for another fascinating exploration of the ideas that shape our world. All right, we're back for the final part of our immigration deep dive. And, I'm feeling energized. We've covered so much ground, from those ancient migrations to the challenges we see today, how history shapes our views even when we don't realize it. But I feel like there's one piece we haven't hit on directly yet.
You're thinking about solutions, right?
Yeah. After all this complexity, it's natural to want to know, okay, what do we do about it all? Our source isn't some policy handbook, but it does hint at some paths forward, I think.
It does. It's easy to feel overwhelmed, like this problem's just too big to solve.
Right.
But history also shows us that humans can do incredible things, even amidst huge challenges. So where do we even begin? Well, remember that conversation we had about historical narratives? It's not just about telling those feel-good stories. It's about being honest about the past, the good ain't the bad. Our source mentions how a lot of countries, they commemorate events like the arrival of certain immigrant groups, which is great.
Like in sense of butt coming.
But are we also acknowledging the less glamorous sides of those stories, like the displacement of native populations, the exploitation of labor, the discrimination that happened? If we're only celebrating the happy parts, we're missing the full picture, right? And then we don't really learn.
It's like those historical plaques you see that just skip over all the messy stuff.
Exactly. We need more nuance. Acknowledging the bad things doesn't erase the good. It just gives us that more complete understanding to learn from.
I totally agree. So that's where education comes in, right? Not just in schools, but throughout our lives.
Lifelong learning, absolutely. The source talks about fostering a more balanced and informed discussion about immigration, being open to perspectives that challenge our own.
Even if they make us uncomfortable, which can be tough.
It can be, but that's how we grow, right? So we've got honest storytelling, ongoing education. What else? Because changing minds isn't enough, we need action too.
There's a whole structural side to this, like you said before, policy stuff.
You got it. The source points out, even well-intentioned policies can be flawed if they're built on a foundation of past inequality. Think back to the Chinese Exclusion Act. Its legacy didn't just disappear.
No, it took decades to even start undoing the damage.
Exactly. So we're not just tweaking the system, we maybe need to reevaluate its very foundations.
That's a tall order. Where would we even start?
It is, but we can't shy away from those tough questions if we want immigration to be seen as part of that shared societal fabric. What assumptions are baked into our laws? Are there unintentional biases? Are we really centering the needs of immigrant communities when we make these policies?
And this is where things get so tricky. So many different viewpoints on what fair immigration policies even look like. The debates can be so divisive.
They can be, absolutely, but The source is pointing to the need to go beyond the politics, focus
Yeah.
on the human element. What's it like for someone to have to leave their home, navigate a new culture, build a life where they might not always feel welcomed?
It comes back to empathy, doesn't it? Really trying to understand other people's experiences. Data is important, but it's not the whole story.
And that's where things like art, literature, personal testimonies, those can be so powerful. They connect us to that human side of immigration we see beyond the numbers.
Okay, so we've got a lot to work with here. Honest storytelling, education that never stops, reforming policies, and that core of empathy. It's a lot, but it feels hopeful.
It does. It does. And what I find really interesting is the source isn't giving us a single solution. It's more like a shift in mindset, seeing immigration not as a problem, but as an opportunity.
To grow, to change, to become something new.
Exactly. And that's a powerful message, I think, because in the end, it's about recognizing our shared humanity. We're interconnected across all these borders, cultures. That's what I'm taking from this whole deep dive.
Me too. It's been quite a journey through history, but also, like you said, a call to action. What will each of us do to contribute to a future where immigration is just part of who we are as a society? That's something I'm going to be thinking about a lot.
And that's the question we'll leave with all of you listening as well. This isn't just for policymakers or experts. This is for everyone. So keep learning, keep challenging those assumptions you might have, and let's work towards a world that welcomes and celebrates what immigrants bring to the table.
I couldn't have said it better myself. Thanks to everyone for joining us on this incredible deep dive into immigration. We'll catch you next time for another exploration of the ideas that shape our world.